Conclusion Part 1 of Essay on the Creative Imagination. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Essay on the Creative Imagination by Théodule Ribaud. Conclusion Part 1. The Foundations of the Creative Imagination. Why is the human mind able to create? In a certain sense, this question may seem idle, childish, and even worse. We might just as well ask, why does man have eyes, and not an electric apparatus like the torpedo? Why does he perceive directly sounds, but not the ultra-red and ultraviolet rays? Why does he perceive changes of odor, but not magnetic changes? And so on ad infinitum. We will put the question in a very different manner. Being given the physical and mental constitution of man, such as it is at present, how is the creative imagination a natural product of this constitution? Man is able to create for two principal reasons. The first, motor in nature, is found in the action of his needs, appetites, tendencies, desires. The second is the possibility of a spontaneous revival of images that become grouped in new combination. 1. We have already shown in detail, see above Part 1, Chapter 2, that the hypothesis of a creative instinct, if the expression is used not as an abbreviated or metaphorical formula, but in the strict sense, is a pure chimera, an empty entity. In studying the various types of imagination, we have always been careful to note that every mode of creation may be reduced, as regards its beginnings, to a tendency, a want, a special determinate desire. Let us recall for the last time these initial conditions of all invention, these desires, conscious or not, that excite it. The wants, tendencies, desires, it matters not which term we adopt, the whole of which constitutes the instinct of individual preservation, have been the generators of all inventions dealing with food-getting, housing, making of weapons, instruments, and machines. The need for individual and social expansion or extension has given rise to military, commercial, and industrial invention, and in its disinterested form, aesthetic creation. As for the sexual instinct, its psychic fertility is in no way less than the physical. It is an inexhaustible source of imagination in everyday life as well as in art. The wants of man in contact with his fellows have engendered, through instinctive or reflective action, the numerous social and practical creations regulating human groups, and they are rough or complex, stable or unstable, just or unjust, kindly or harsh. The need of knowing and of explaining, well or ill, has created myths, religions, philosophical systems, scientific hypotheses. Every want, tendency, or desire may, then, become creative, by itself or associated with others, and into these final elements it is that analysis must resolve creative spontaneity. This vague expression corresponds to a sum, not to a special property. It is a postulate of contemporary physiology that all the neurons taken together cannot spontaneously, that is, of themselves, give rise to any movement. They receive from without and expend their energy outwards. Nevertheless, between the two moments that, in reflex and instinctive actions, seem continuous, a third interposes, which, for the higher psychic acts, may be of long duration. Thus, reasonings in logical form, and reflection regarding a decision to be made, have a feeble tendency to become changed into acts. Their motor effects are indirect, and at a long range. But this intermediate moment is par excellence the moment for psychology. It is also the moment of the personal equation. Every man receives, transforms, and restores outwards according to his own organization, temperament, idiosyncrasies, character. In a word, according to his personality, of which needs, tendencies, desires are the direct and immediate expression. So we come back, by another route, to the same definition of spontaneity. Every invention, then, has a motor origin. The ultimate basis of the constructive imagination is motor. 2. But needs and desires by themselves cannot create. They are only a stimulus and a spring. Whence arises the need of a second condition, the spontaneous revival of images. In many animals that are endowed only with memory, the return of images is always provoked. Sensation from without or from within bring them into consciousness under the form, pure and simple, of former experience, whence we have reproduction, repetition without new associations. People of slight imagination and used to routine approach this mental condition. But as a matter of fact, man from his second year on, and some higher animals, go beyond this stage. They are capable of spontaneous revival. By this term I mean the revival that comes about abruptly, without apparent antecedents. we know that these act in a latent form, and consist of thinking by analogy, affective dispositions, unconscious elaboration. This sudden appearance excites other states which, grouped into new associations, contain the first elements of the creative act. Taken together, and however numerous its manifestations, the constructive imagination seems to me reducible to three forms, which I shall call sketched, fixed, objectified, according as it remains an internal fancy, or takes on a material but contingent and unstable form, or is subjected to the conditions of a rigorous internal or external determinism. A. The sketched form is primordial, original, the simplest of all. It is a nascent moment or a first attempt. It appears first of all in dreaming, an embryonic, unstable, and uncoordinated manifestation of the creative imagination, a transition stage between passive reproduction and organized construction. A step higher is reverie, whose flitting images, associated by chance, without personal intervention, are nevertheless vivid enough to exclude from consciousness every impression of the external world, so much so that the daydreamer re-enters it only with a shock of surprise. More coherent are the imaginary constructions known as castles in Spain, the works of a wish considered unrealizable, fancies of love, ambition, power, and wealth, the goal of which seems to be forever beyond our reach. Lastly, still higher, come all the plans for the future conceived vaguely and as barely possible, foreseeing the end of a sickness, of a business enterprise, of a political event, etc. This vague and outline imagination, penetrating our entire life, has its peculiar characters. The unifying principle is nil or ephemeral, which fact always reduces it to the dream as a type. It does not externalize itself, does not change into acts, a consequence of its basically chimerical nature or of weakness of will, which reduces it to a strictly internal and individual existence. It is needless to say that this kind of imagination is a permanent and definite form, with the dreamers living in a world of ceaselessly reappearing images, having no power to organize them, to change them into a work of art, a theory, or a useful invention. The sketched form is or remains an elementary, primitive, automatic form. Conformably to the general law ruling the development of mind, passage from indefinite to definite, from the incoherent to the coherent, from spontaneity to reflection, from the reflex to the voluntary period, the imagination comes out of its swaddling clothes, is changed through the intervention of a teleological act that assigns it an end, through the union of rational elements that subdue it for an adaptation. Then appear the other two forms. B. The fixed form comprises mythic and aesthetic creations, philosophical and scientific hypotheses. While the outline imagination remains an internal phenomenon, existing only in and for a single individual, the fixed form is projected outwards, made something else. The former has no reality other than the momentary belief accompanying it. The latter exists by itself, for its creator and for others. The work is accepted, rejected, examined, criticized. Fiction rests on the same level as reality. Do not people discuss seriously the objective value of certain myths and of metaphysical theories? The action of a novel or drama as though it were a matter of real events? The character of the dramatis personae as though they were living flesh and blood? The fixed imagination moves in an elastic frame. The material elements circumscribing it and composing it have a certain fluidity. They are language, writing, musical sounds, colors, forms, lines. Furthermore, we know that its creations, in spite of the spontaneous adherence of the mind accepting them, are the work of a free will. They could have been otherwise. They preserve an indelible imprint of contingency and subjectivity. C. This last mark is rubbed out without disappearing, for a thing imagined is always a personal thing in the objectified form that comprises successful practical inventions, whether mechanical, industrial, commercial, military, social, or political. These have no longer an arbitrary, borrowed reality. They have their place in the totality of physical and social phenomena. They resemble creations of nature, subject like them to fixed conditions of existence and to a limited determinism. We shall not dwell longer on this last character, so often pointed out. In order the better to comprehend the distinction between the three forms of imagination, let us borrow for a moment the terminology of spiritualism or of the common dualism, merely as a means of explaining the matter clearly. The outline imagination is a soul without a body, a pure spirit, without determination in space. The fixed imagination is a soul or spirit surrounded by an almost immaterial sheath, like angels or demons, genii, shadows, the double of savages, the perisprit of spiritualists, etc. The objectified imagination is a soul and body, a complete organization after the pattern of living people. The ideal is incarnated, but it must undergo transformation, reductions, and adaptations, in order that it may become practical, just as the soul, according to spiritualism, must bend to the necessities of the body, to be at the same time the servant of, and served by, the bodily organs. According to general opinion, the great imaginers are found only in the first two classes, which is in the strict sense of the word true, in the full sense of the word false. As long as it remains outline, or even fixed, the constructive imagination can reign as supreme mistress. Objectified, it still rules, but shares its power with competitors. It avails naught without them. They can do nothing without it. What deceives us is the fact that we see it no longer in the open. Here the imaginative stroke resembles those powerful streams of water that must be imprisoned in a complicated network of canals and ramifications, varying in shape and in diameter, before bursting forth in multiple jets and in liquid architecture. Besides these three principal forms, there are three intermediate forms, transitions from one category to another, that are hard to classify. Certain mythic creations are half sketched, half fixed, and we find religious and social and political conceptions, partly theoretical or fixed, partly practical or objective. End of conclusion. Part 1.